Well, welcome everyone. My name is Stephen Backman, and I am your host for this event through the MEP, the Marxist Education Project. For those that are new to it, the MEP, as the MEP, in 2 months will celebrate its 10th anniversary. And we probably will have we will have a public event in New York at that time. And I was thinking, appropriate to what we're talking about today, that those 10 years have been 10 years of great new mass movements and struggles. And this article and some of the others that each of you, our two guests, wrote separately and together have been mulling political and organizational strategy against that background. So the MEP as the MEP is 10 years old, but I'm sure many of you know that it has been around for almost 50 years now in New York, starting out as the Brecht Forum and then the New York Marxist School, long before I got involved. The MEP sponsors a number of weekly study groups and reading groups and special events like this, typically on Saturday afternoons. Great for you to all be here. I know it's not an ideal time, but Saturday afternoons is a nice compromise for different time zones. This event about this article was prompted by a short conversation I had with Carl about a month ago about one of the reading groups that we just started, which is reading several books about organizational and political strategy, including probably the best known one, If We Burn, which is kind of making its rounds, by Vincent Bevins, who also will be visiting the MEP next week. And Carl expressed interest in it, but he also mentioned that you and Bill had just written this article, which we'll get into more in a minute or so. And yeah, the article is now almost 6 months old, and it kind of came back to me, but I did have to reread it. And the way this is going to work is that I will say just a few more words to introduce this, then have Bill and Carl talk for as much as you want about the article, and I'll key it up with the beginning question. And then we'll have discussion. And I will start the discussion because I've been thinking about questions to ask, and then we'll open it up to everybody else. The best way to let us know that you want to speak, respond, pose a question is to use the chat and just say the one word stack, and then I'll know that you're in order to speak. At events of this size and larger, the MEP uses a progressive stack, which means that I will watch for people who haven't spoken, and also trying to keep it representative of the audience. This is being recorded. This is a public, these Saturday afternoon events are typically public events. If you don't want to be recorded, you can turn off your camera and you can rename yourself so that you're invisible. But this will likely go up on YouTube within a week. And as I mentioned before we started, a number more people registered or expressed interest, and with a lot of our events, people plan to just watch the video later. So I'm glad all of you will be here, and I probably have lots of questions. So for this audience, Bill and Carl probably don't really need an introduction, and I'll let you introduce yourself in a minute. But relevant to what we're talking about, both of you have been involved with the movement for many decades, kind of intertwined paths going back to the SDS and movements, campaigns, but organizations of the 1970s and 80s. And I have been collaborating on a number of things in the last couple of years. So this article, I'm sure you have some things you want to say to introduce it. My one general question is, why this article last fall? Why now? And if you will, what people, campaigns, movements did you have in mind, and what has been the response?
Carl, why don't you kick it off?
Well, for me, the article focuses on a question I've been struggling with for a very long time. You mentioned the other book that we were discussing, and horizontalism. I was there with I was a full-blown horizontalist early in my SDS career. As I remember, when we were first running for the national office, I was running on a platform where we might abolish it altogether and just build a movement. And that was sort of the phrase. Later on, in a different phase of my life, I was engaged. I was a member of the League of Revolutionary Struggle. And we were engaged in Harold Washington campaign and Jesse Jackson campaigns. And we did a lot of very good work in those two campaigns and learned a lot. But our line in it was what was our special task as a LRS, and it was, in addition to carrying out the work of the campaign, it was to build a movement. Our task was to build a movement. And so I learned sort of through negative experience that build a movement was like take 2 aspirin and see me in the morning. It was a universal answer to just about everything. Well, we have to build a movement. And I finally got sick of it. And I thought, this is not right. I think a key turning point was I was reading a long article by Lars Lynn, who had done a new translation of Lenin's What Is to Be Done. There were already 3 translations out there, but he still felt the need to write a 4th one. So I read his, and he made a very interesting point in it that shaped my thinking a lot. He said he took the Russian word for that was usually translated as spontaneous. And he said, even though it might look like spontaneous in English, he said, the closer reading of what Lenin meant by the term was elemental. In other words, instead of talking about spontaneous risings, he said they were better described as elemental risings. So that set off a light bulb in my head. And I had always been of the opinion that movements came in waves. Everything in the universe comes in waves. Light comes in waves. All sorts of things comes in waves. And so movements too come in waves. Some people would argue, why so-and-so it's your fault, the movement ebbed, And I began to see that, no, that's not quite right. The nature of movements as elemental risings is that they rise and they reach a peak and then they ebb. That's in the nature of things. So you don't really blame yourself or your organization for the fact that movements ebb. They do. And they also come back again. And sometimes you have something to do with it by setting off a spark, and sometimes nobody actually plans it. It's like we said in the article. The day before certain things happen, nobody had any idea that a huge movement, an elemental rising, would be the result of it. But nonetheless, we were swept up in the midst of it. So I thought that we needed to sum up the lessons here. That number one, there was a difference between movements on one end of a continuum and campaigns on the other. And while they were deeply interconnected, they were also different. And it was important to understand it if we were going to understand our tasks. Naturally, we carry out our tasks within movements, but our task was, first of all, campaigning. And campaigning requires a degree of organization. And beyond that, it requires a rather more sophisticated levels of organization at all levels, not only the mass organization and the intermediate organizations, but especially the revolutionary organization, to use Marta Honecker's term, the revolutionary instrument. That had to be built as well. So in that way, you would have a force, an organized force that could carry you from one peak of one wave down through its ebb, and then when another one rose up again, you could connect. So you could continue to build your organizational strength as you move from one wave to another, and you would come out, ideally speaking, on the other end. So anyway, that was my level of thinking. I tied it to the question of party building.
And sort of in addition to what Carl was saying, I think I was driven to this for, in some ways, the same reason that Vincent Bevins wrote his book. I was trying to figure out about a lot of what I've seen since 2011. The Madison Uprising, Occupy, so-called Arab Spring, and a number of other upsurges that have taken place. And it's led me to do a lot of thinking about anarchism, semi-anarchism, as well as voluntarism. And the looking at the Black Lives Matter explosion of 2020 and how little was left in the aftermath. And so Carl and I had these discussions about social movements, campaigns, and organization building, and the relationship of them. And as I was saying, you hear a lot of this reference to movement building. I've used the term as well. But what we're really talking about is actually building campaigns, and in certain ways, hoping that those campaigns contribute to the resurgence of a movement, or in some cases, starting something. I'll stop there.
Good, nice, concise beginning points. And Bill, I'm glad that you mentioned your current thinking. Carl's background also, I'm sure, rang a lot of bells for a lot of us. I was looking back through, and another article that, Bill, that you wrote with somebody else 2 years ago, which I wrote down the name of, but it was also in Convergence, seemed to be saying that many people who were in organizations were kind of cocooned in their organizations and weren't engaged enough in the political struggles that were going on.
That's right. Yeah, it's what Mao Zedong called mountain stronghold mentality.
Yeah.
Yeah, a term that I always loved because, there's, what's that expression when a word, the use of a word, it completely brings to mind exactly what the meaning is. And mountain stronghold mentality was a reference from the Chinese Revolution, where there were guerrilla bands of the communists that were basically on mountaintops, and they had set up their base areas there, and they would come down and attack the Kuomintang and then retreat, and everything was hunky-dory except when the leadership of the party said, we actually need to change the form of warfare. And there was great resistance by many of the guerrilla commanders because they were comfortable. They were secure. And I have seen in the left the same phenomena over and over again, with organizations justifying their existence largely because of the comfort of their members. And the comfort can be anything. I don't mean necessarily material comfort, but the organizational culture might be generational, it might be regional or whatever. And this real fear of taking risks. And part of what we have to be always thinking about is that the work that we do, we don't know what it's going to result in. We know that there will ultimately be explosions, but we never know when they're going to happen. And anyone says that they do is either lying or they're insane. No one could have predicted the so-called Arab Spring when it happened. There was no anticipation of that. And yet it happened, and it turned out to be more than the Arab world. The outcome was not predictable. There were many possible outcomes, but one of the lessons that we can learn is about this question of organization, which is also Stephen why I wrote this piece a number of years ago, The Modern Tecumseh, when I've been trying to grapple with issues of strategy and using Tecumseh in much the way that Gramsci used the Modern Prince, to make certain points about what we need to do now. And so this question of organization looms, but organizations can't replace mass movements. And when they try, they usually screw things up.
Yeah, that was a great article. So you seem, in talking about the present, you seem to be you are describing a different situation than the one, Carl, you were talking about decades earlier. And also on a much smaller scale, it seemed like the mood of that article in 2022 seems not quite the opposite of this most recent article, but it seems like the balance of priority between needing to work on organization building, work on focus campaigns, it sometimes can take more precedence, and at other times it seems like people are in the mountain stronghold. So maybe since you started, Carl, or either of you, maybe respond to that. Like, how do you know what the balance is if there is some tension between the two, like I'm saying?
Oh, one argument I often give these days when we're talking about, the common project, or old-fashioned terms, the Popular Front or the United Front. And there's all sorts of arguments going on among people who know each other. And one thing I usually do is I tell people, look, you have to get outside your comfort zone. You have to do this work among people you don't know, people to your right, even to the right of the progressive movement, or actually you can go beyond that. You can go into the center, and you have to learn to practice the mass line and all the different things. You have to talk to people, and you're going to be uncomfortable doing it. And actually, I've said that's important. If you're not uncomfortable when you're building a united front, you're not doing it right. There's no sense in uniting with people who are already united. You have to develop your common effort or your common project by drawing in and building a base among those who you normally would be uncomfortable with. So that's an important way to understand organization building within a broader movement There could be a broader upsurge where you'll find all kinds of people. Many you'll agree with, some you won't. There will be people who are not active. I learned in Chicago, we had an argument as to the importance of winning a city council majority to vote against the war or to put out now on the ballot. And I counted up 50,000 people in Chicago who at one time or another took to the streets around the anti-war movement. And I pointed out to some of our left critics, I said, and half of those 50,000 people were all Democrats, rank and file up to the leadership. But then when we got it on the ballot, now that was a long story as to how, but we did. We had 800,000 people vote for it just in the city of Chicago. So I said, that is people we don't talk to out there. And most of them are Democrats, but some are center forces, even if you might be right. But they're against the war in Iraq. We have to be. They are there. The 800,000, by voting against the out now in the war, they told us they were there, but they were not yet active. They were not yet part of our organizations, and we rarely talked to them. So that was, if we want to really build organization and campaign, that in the process of doing that, you can still enhance a movement. I don't think we should be utterly passive towards movement. There's a great deal to be said for fanning the flames of a movement. But to fan the flames of movements, you have to have something to fan the flames with. And it can't be you can't just rely upon what you're comfortable with. To use Bill's point, you have to get out where you're uncomfortable if you want to do it properly.
Yeah, I would add the left need to be filmmakers and not photographers, and I mean that metaphorically. That we can't just be looking at a moment. We've got to look at the trajectory. We've got to look at the tendency of things and see how they're moving, and not get stuck in a moment. And it might be a glorious moment. Like when you think about the 2020 protests and uprisings, it was a glorious moment. And many people that I interacted with came to absolutely the wrong conclusion, which is they thought this might go on forever. They downplayed the importance of building organization to come out of this. They never anticipated the counterattack by the right. Never. Just thought, we're ever victorious. And I think, we've got to be thinking about, what's the trajectory? And as Carl was saying, things will inevitably decline. What you want to prevent is a rout. It's not like you can stop the decline, but you've got to prevent a rout. And we're not very good at that. We often get routed. And so these are some of the things, Stephen, that we've got to be looking at in terms of it. Here's the other thing. When I look at the 1930s, one of the major contributing factors to the success in building a new trade union movement was the work of the left, most importantly the CP, but not just the CP. And the work that the CP had been doing and others for years in working inside the American Federation of Labor, operating outside, helped to lay the foundations, but that they didn't cause the movement of the 30s. They were instrumental in that and helping it, but they weren't the cause. And so when we get away from that, when we get away from sort of self-importance, and we understand that these events are going to be happening, and we've got to be positioned so that we can take advantage of them and help them build. But one final thing, which is in taking advantage, we've got to be careful about what I call the surfer's view of socialism. And the surfer's view of socialism is, you know, how the surfers, they go out in the water, paddle out, right? And then they wait for the big wave. And then they basically get on that and ride that bad boy into land. And there's many people on the left that think of that's what we do. We have our surfboard, right? It's all together. We know our shit, right? We're going to paddle out and we're just going to wait for that great mass wave of the people. And we're going to get on and we're going to ride into power, damn it. And, you know, leaving aside, I mean, there's a long history to that approach. And it's one that leaves aside the issue of where do ideas come from. It leaves aside that nothing that we create is perfect and it needs to be changed in the process of struggle. We are nowhere without a movement, but we're not going to simply ride the movement.
Taking off on Bill for a minute.
Okay.
I once tried to formulate what I call the default position of the left for the last 50 years that I've been involved in it. And I won't go into the 30s, but the default position goes something like this. You organize a demonstration, you build a movement, it gets bigger. You build another demonstration, it gets bigger. And you build coalitions, and they get wider and broader. And one end of it gets more militant, and you keep building and building and building until you have 1 million people in Washington on a single day. And then finally, you get the force of your movement to get a liberal or a group of liberals in Congress to do the right thing. So I gave a name to this. I called it street syndicalism, the street syndicalist deviation. Why? Because there's no component in it where we ourselves take governing power. It's all various combined ways of influencing the liberals who are there to do the right thing, to give us a proper reform. But there's no way where we ourselves take governing power to provoke a different kind of crisis or to arrive at a different kind of crisis, one that calls into question the possibility of a new order, and that where we have some governing power and people with experience in governing power to be able to make that happen, as well as continue to build the huge street actions. I'm not negating those. I'm saying they alone will lead you to a street syndicalist deviation. And in a way, our government has given backhanded support to the street syndicalist deviation through the tax code, the 501c3. What's the first thing people do when they decide they want to build a political organization? Well, we have to write a grant. Who can we write a grant to? And so people write grants, and sometimes they get them, sometimes they don't. And I'm not against 501c3s. I ran one for many years. But what does a 501c3 tell you? One, you can't vote for this or that person. And two, you can't vote for this or that piece of legislation. You can do education around it. You can do street actions around it. But you have these limitations. So it's a kind of federal government backhanded support for the street syndicalist deviation. So anyway, that's a name for what it is that I think we have to overcome.
Let's see if we can take this. These are great points, great conversation. Let's see if we can take this down a level, upper level, into more specifics. One of you, I won't say who, a few minutes ago said that somebody would be either a liar or delusional if they could predict when large mass movement was going to break out. And I was thinking about, well, one mass movement that has just broken out is the against the war in Gaza, against U.S. participation in it, by funding it, sending arms. And the media are full of articles that that this just broke out. Yeah, there is actually a war going on, but the fact that this time, after so many other times, it's had such a broad response, who could have predicted it? They would have had to be a liar or delusional. But then on the other hand, going back decades, there have been people building campaigns, doing the work, and for other reasons, which we might come to, I was rereading articles, for example, that Angela Davis wrote 50 years ago, her and others about this. So the people who have been in the middle of it might not have been able to predict the exact moment, but they might have anticipated that it was going to happen.
Correct. But you see, what I'm talking about is I predict we're going to win. I do. In fact, I know we're going to win. Now, what good does that do, Stephen? Right? You know what I mean? It's like, yes, I think that there were people that have at different points predicted that there would be an upsurge in some setting. And, you know, that and a couple of bucks gets you across town. I mean, you know, it promotes optimism. But what it doesn't tell you is when it's going to happen. And I'm not saying that you should. I'm not saying that we should bring in some medium that's going to basically sit us all down and help us figure out the date when stuff jumps off. I'm all in favor of optimism, but what I'm saying more is that we have to build organizations that are in touch with reality and in touch with the developments that are happening and are watching carefully. And that's different from predicting when something is going to happen. So we got to be positioned and have to be flexible. I'll give you an example of something that happened. I was one of the founders, as Cappy will know, of the Black Radical Congress. And after September 11th, 2001, there was a debate that opened up. Now, prior to September 11th, we had a basic plan of action. After September 11th, there were a number of us that said the world has changed and we've got to really reflect that in what the action and work of the BRC is. And there were people that said, no, we've got a plan. We made a proposal. We said we were going to do X. We shouldn't just be like throwing that away. So as opposed to understanding what was new in the moment and the ramifications, there were people that were stuck in formality. And that's what kills work. So instead of understanding something dramatic had changed on September 11th, and we needed to be prepared to deal with that on multiple levels, the other view said, no, let's stick with what we said we were going to do, damn it, and proceed forward. And I think that that's incredibly mechanical.
Fair enough. Carl, did you want to add anything?
No, that hits it on the head for me.
Yeah.
I remember at the time, I decided to write a position paper on the Al Qaeda's attacks, criticizing Al Qaeda, and taking a what I called an American defenses position. that it was proper to try to prevent another one. Not necessarily in the way U.S. imperialism would do it, but there was a proper way to do it, and we should fight for it. And I was roundly trounced because I had ventured into, uncomfortable territory. It wasn't just the tried and true answers of oppose U.S. imperialism no matter what. I said, no, something new has happened here. And in fact, it had. People were immobilized for a long period of time until a small band of us, Marilyn Katz, whose memorial service I just went to, being one of them, myself and Jim Weinstein and Mike Klonsky, we melded all of our address books and called a demonstration against the war in Iraq, or the pending war in Iraq in Chicago, and we invited a young, unknown state rep named Barack Obama to come and give a speech at it. So it changed the turf. It changed the terrain of what was possible, and we finally broke the silence. But we had to build an anti-war movement we built it in different terms than we had in the past.
So both of you are saying that we can anticipate that something will break out at some point, but we don't know exactly when. But it also seems that you haven't quite said who is the we that can be ready to respond. Carl, you eliminated 501c3s. It reminds me of a great book from some time ago, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, which I recently, it was like 20 years ago. Still worth a read if you need a reminder. Are you, in relation to that, since the 2020 Black Lives Matter in the United States, there's been more talk of the need to go back to building cadre organizations. Are you saying those are the ones that can be ready without being delusional? Or what other kinds of organizations are there? And what is the spectrum between what arises in the moment and organizations that can be ready to respond? It can't just be all one or the other.
Well, we need organization at every level. Organization is our strength. The bourgeoisie has police forces and prisons and guns and all kinds of money. They have organization too, but we don't have a lot of that. But what we do have is organization. And if we learn it well, we can build it on all kinds of levels. Some of you heard this story, but I might tell it here for those who haven't. I learned it from Wilfred Burchett, a longtime writer for The Guardian, who wrote from behind enemy lines, so to speak. He wrote from the side of Vietnam. He told me this story once about the Red Prince, Savanavong, in Laos. The French had busted him at one point and put him in prison outside of Vientiane. And at a certain point, they decided to put him on trial, so they sent a squad out to the prison to bring him into the city so they could put him on trial. They got there. The prison was empty. Savanavong had first organized all the prisoners. Then he organized all the guards. Then he organized the warden. And they all packed up, took all the weapons and everything, and headed off to the liberated zone. That's the power of organization. And I never forgot Wilfred's telling me that, about the importance of organization at all levels. Not only the Revolutionary Party building organization, which I've always, Mao Zedong, and even though I don't call myself a Maoist these days, I still call myself a student of Mao. Mao Zedong said we had three magic weapons. And one of them was the party, the revolutionary instrument. The other was the common front, the united front. One of the, in my school I went to in China, the older guy sat by the side of working class communists. I asked him what the united front meant. He said, we communists are always in a minority. Even in China today, we're in a minority. But who makes history? History is made by the masses, and there are millions. The vast majority of them aren't communists. So we have to have a way to connect with them, an instrument to connect with them, and that's the United Front. The third magic weapon, and Mao said it was the People's Army, and the way I translate that here, we have to have a capacity for self-defense. Most of it is probably nonviolent. We need deeper training in it, but we need the other kind. And I would look to the Deacons for dissensions rather than the Panthers to try to build upon. So we have to pay attention to all three of those three magic weapons, as well as even mass organization, trade unions, community groups, progressive Democrats, my Alquippa Democratic Party, which is all working class and very multinational and very left-leaning. I have to build organization at every level.
We need a party for socialism, Stephen, of 1 million people.
Wait, Bill, before you speak, I see Susan has raised her hand because in the chat I mentioned that I'm going to pass this over to other people's thoughts, questions. So this would be a good time to put yourself on stack to speak. I have more questions in case nobody has that much to say. But yeah, so Susan and then Peruse in a few minutes. But go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, we need a party for socialism of at least 1 million people. And cadre organizations, if they're not building that, they're irrelevant. And if that's not their objective, they're irrelevant. We're in a country of more than 350 million people. And if you eliminate people under the age of 18, we're still talking about, 200 and something million people? And in that environment, organizations of a few hundred people are important, but are not going to really lead change. And when we start thinking at the level of like a party of 1 million people or even 100,000 people, what I keep saying to folks is that means it's not going to be an organization of you and your best friends. It's not going to be an organization of people, all of whom you like, all of whom are from the same generation. It's going to be very complicated. And we don't have a lot of good experience with that, in part because there are organizations that generational, they freeze and they don't accommodate themselves to the changes brought by new generations. There are also organizations that are formed quite explicitly on a generational basis with the belief that every generation should form its own left organizations. But again, there is this sort of assumption that in relatively small groups we can do it, and the right doesn't believe that, and I'm not quite sure why we do. So I think we have to have a real rethinking, and it becomes really complicated because there are things that the left has to try to figure out more concretely about operating, given the nature of the state, the democratic capitalist state, and given and its unevenness by region, but also given the particular danger we're facing now from the far right. And what does that mean in terms of the way that we operate? So there, because we're not going to just win this based in New York City and the Bay Area. It's not going to happen.
So we got a couple of people that want to speak. I mean, that have put themselves on the list to speak, and I'm sure others will once we get started. So I may seize this back in a little while, but why don't we start? So Susan, you.
Yeah, thank you. Steve, I really appreciate the reference to the revolution will not be funded. But you said something about, well, we can write off nonprofits, and that's not the point. The point is that in strategy, there's a role for nonprofits. I'm pretty active in the California Alliance for Retired Americans, which is part of a national constituency group of the AFL-CIO for retired people. And in California, we mobilize seniors from around the state to visit every state legislator during our lobby days. So there's considerable member development to educate people about lobbying on specific issues. The nonprofits are not all the same, obviously. You've got from the Heritage Foundation to symphony orchestras and yada yada, but there are significant forces. For example, I want to look at Planned Parenthood because the revolution will not be funded was written by women of color, especially in the domestic violence world, and they were arguing that accepting government funding from law enforcement had changed the nature of their involvement with their own members. So when you find a movement, a nonprofit group that values membership and development of membership and mobilization, it's different than solely funded lobbying in the Beltway kind of thing. So we need to distinguish. There seems to be kind of a knee-jerk approach to nonprofits among some of my younger comrades in DSA of nonprofits are for shit. Let's make the revolution. And actually, they can be an important part of a strategy of the Common Project or United Front.
Yes, thank you. I was speaking a little bit offhandish, and those of you who know me, my work for decades has been with this and that nonprofit. So I was kind of riffing off of what Carl said rather than.
By the way, I didn't say, I said we just had to be careful with them. I ran a nonprofit, and I think there's a role for them, but we can't let them control us.
Yeah, and I've seen them do some real terrible things.
Agreed. And I see Bill put a comment in chat. Peruse, did you have your hand up, or was I just seeing Susan's?
No, I had my hand up.
Okay, go.
Well, thank you, Bill and Carl. I want to add something here. It's slightly different. I think our concept of organization, and generally the way I see it, I think part of the problem is the left itself, in the sense of the fact that it looks at organizational skills as it relates to the state, really. This approach towards changing the state and taking over the state when it doesn't have really much when it has not really done its homework on the base. And that base, in terms of organization, I would say the most important thing that I am coming across is the language of the left and how it limits itself in its own vocabulary. So I think when you're talking about the passive revolution, in the sense that people are not really active in that, and you're talking about the prediction of the events, of course you can predict the events. You just have to be able to be in the moment to know what is really happening. We had Sam Tata, a photographer who captured the Chinese Revolution, and I asked him in Montreal, so how in the world you were able to take these photos? He said, I wasn't going around shooting. I just anticipated the moment that is coming, and I was there, right? So when we are talking about something like the women life freedom movement in Iran, and you look at that event, what was the role of the American left in supporting that event? I remember it very clearly. The only one who came out at the right moment and was there to speak was Angela Davis. There was nobody else. And I said to myself, my God, the amount of energy she gives me personally when you are there to be, you know? So the timing and the moment, and also when I'm talking about the language, I'm talking about the language of cinema, the language of paintings, the language of theater, what I see in New York and other places in United States. All of the arts, all of the literature is part and parcel of the language of bringing about meaningful change. And that is what the organizational skill implies. How are you applying to reach out in terms of what Carl is saying, to come out of your comfort zone? It means to come out of your talking zone of Zooms, to go into other mediums and other places, to be there like Angela Davis was for us.
Thoughts from our Carl, Bill? Otherwise, we'll take the next comment.
Yes, I don't want to make a big thing of this, but I'm not into predictions. I'm into scenario planning. The US left has been very good at predicting 10 of the last 3 recessions. And this, I remember in 1980, the predictions that the 1980s were going to be the decade for the left. Didn't quite work out that way. But I think scenario planning, which is what the military does, is exactly what we should be doing, and right now we should be doing about what happens after November, and looking at possibilities, and then what does that mean about the way we need to organize and what we should be doing. So I think that is really important.
Well pushed. Paul, I believe you had asked to speak.
Well, there's so much to respond to. First, thanks to Carl and Bill for their accumulated wisdom, which I've always tried to learn from. Yeah, I've chosen to put a lot of effort into DSA because, for one thing, it's multi-generational. There aren't many of us old folks around, but there are some of us, and we haven't. I think it's important, as Michael Harrington taught us when he criticized himself for breaking with SDS after Port Huron, is that he wasn't there when they needed him. And I think we old folks have to be there when our generation of our grandchildren is facing a real test. And being with them and actively working on campaigns, also doing some mentoring and some counseling. I really think that's the most significant thing I can do now. There is young people tend toward mountaintopism because they're concerned about purity. It's very, and they're concerned about their comfort zone. There was this big effort in DSA for a while. You had to make everybody feel comfortable, and you got to be pure. And that's I think, an adolescent trait that we have to we understand but struggle with. But I've been thinking I've always been a movement person, not a cadre person. I've always wanted to pick up a monkey wrench when I heard the word cadre, but I'm starting to rethink that after conversations with Steve Williams that Susan alluded to, with the sort of post-Roots Action project of, I guess, what they want to call North Star Socialist Organization. I think it's great to look at I mean, we have to discipline ourselves somehow. And if cadre is a way to do it, that's fine. But the key is the cadre does not become inward looking. It has to be always outward looking. And it always has to be open uh, toward collaboration and working together with people of, as Carl said correctly, are to mostly to the right of people that are consciously socialist. So how we do all that and fly the plane, uh, all I can say is it's exciting. Uh, I want to twit Bill and Carl for publishing their article in Convergence on October 6th, which means they didn't have to take into account Gaza, the Gaza situation. And maybe my question would be, a lot of opportunities have opened up for movement and organization building since October 7th. But what are the, I'm trying to think, what are the immediate tasks we need to do? I mean, of course, one is to survive the MAGA threat. But maybe Carl and Bill might want to question, what has anything changed in their analysis since October 7th? Thanks.
Well, a great deal has changed because of Gaza. I mean, we always needed to exercise some independence and initiative vis-a-vis the Biden and the Third Way group in the Democratic Party. Before Gaza, we were mainly criticizing him around certain aspects of immigration policy and his weaknesses in his industrial policy. But once Gaza, now there's a vast arena where we have to exercise our the call for a ceasefire and self-determination for Palestine, and to drive a wedge between him and Bibi and the Likud as best we can. And now we're beginning to see some of the fruits of that with Schumer coming out the other day. So we have to keep that up. Like I said, just before I came to this session, I was down with a bunch of people at our local courthouse demonstrating around Gaza, ceasefire in Gaza and self-determination in Palestine. And so we have to do that, but we can't do that in isolation from everything else that's going on. We have to understand, yes, we have to exercise independence and initiative, but we have a broader context in mind. We have to keep our eyes on the prize. In other words, we have to do all this, but we also have to understand in 258 days who we have to defeat.
I would add that the explosion in the United States after October 7th was the result of years and years of work that has been carried out, often in silence, often without any credit. I'm talking about scholarly work as well as mass work. That was done, the work of Edward Said, of course, Rashid Holiday, and many others, Nora Ericott, and the development of things like Students for Justice in Palestine, a number of delegations that have gone over to the occupied territories, the Dream Defense. I mean, so there's a whole list, and that's part of what I was talking about. That it's like the development of this movement was on one level predictable, but when it was going to happen and the scale of it, I think surprised everybody. And the repression that we've been getting, we're largely unprepared for. And the way that this repression has moved beyond the question of Palestine, and the way that the issue of anti-Semitism is being used. So I think that's part of the development. I would add, Paul, that we have a task on the left, I think, of broadening our internationalism and opposing isolationism. I was reading something the other day from, can't remember whether it was Politico, about J.D. Vance and about his vision is to build a right wing that's like the right wing that existed in the United States between World War I and World War II. An isolationist movement that plays with populism. And one of the things about so-called isolationism in the United States is that it's actually not isolationism. It's never really been that. It's two things. One is to cast a blind eye towards right-wing political developments in Europe, and the second is to free the United States from obligations, treaties. When we hear the right wing talking about isolationism, they don't really mean that. They don't really mean withdrawing from the world. They mean much more having a freer hand when they can do things. And so this is part of what we got to deal with. So the anti-nuclear movement, and particularly I'm talking about anti-nuclear war. There were these treaties that Trump let expire. It actually started under Bush. And a lot of us on the left just sort of ignored it, or even if we knew that it was happening. But these various treaties that have been very important in terms of non-proliferation have been allowed to expire. That is consistent with the so-called isolationism of the MAGA forces. They don't want to be restricted. They want to be able to do what Putin is arguing that he wants to do in Ukraine, which is use tactical nuclear weapons and threaten France and other countries with strategic nuclear weapons. So I think that broadening our understanding of internationalism, opposing isolationism, even when it comes from people that are progressive. Jeff Foe, the founder of the Economic Policy Institute, wrote something a few months ago arguing in favor of a left-wing approach to isolationism. Shocked the hell out of me. And the other thing post-October 7th, well, no, it's not post-October 7th, is that we have to really go after the Putin Republicans. And there are unfortunately progressives that, and some people that call themselves leftists, that are prepared to shake hands with the Putin Republicans in their opposition to defending Ukraine's war against Russian aggression. And I think we have to be very careful of red-brown alliances.
So a couple of people are waiting to speak. Cappy and Susan, who I'll call in a minute. Just apropos of what you just said, Bill, just mentioned, just this morning I saw there's a podcast which I sometimes listen to, The Best of the Left, which has a whole episode on the party of Putin and the propaganda leading the GOP to Trump and the U.S. to Russian-style autocracy. I do recommend it. Best of the Left. I'll put a link to it. So Cappy and then Susan, and then I'm going to take back the reins for a minute or two.
Just please put the link in the chat. When Bill was talking about the scenario planning, it made me think about my brief time working with Harry Haywood 45 years ago in Atlanta. And he was very insistent there's always going to be an upsurge. You never know what it's going to be. It's always, but there's going to be an upsurge. And our duty is to be prepared to push that upsurge as whenever it comes, whatever form it comes, as far as it can go. And I think that when we start identifying the upsurges, the different kinds of upsurges, or even just the different upsurges in one community, you begin to see that you can't even the forms that it can take are much recognizable in hindsight, but not at the beginning. Any new idea or a new activity could generate something. We're just not going to be, but we need to be prepared and work hard. And there's been many, like Bill said, there's been much work that was done in the last 10, 20 years on Palestine that laid the groundwork for what's going on right now.
Good point. Susan.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to Peru's comment about the lack of feminist or women's movement or anti-patriarchal response to the women life freedom movement. I believe that from the 70s into the 80s, there was a tendency that I was probably part of to regard all women's organizing as positive and anti-patriarchal, and all African American and people of color organizing as progressive. And it's both of those still are true to some extent, but we have class divisions in both movements, and I actually think that the work around the lack of support for prisoners' rights and criminal justice reform that came out in the Black Lives Matter movement was against a long history of civil rights, like the famous compliance of the Black Caucus in Congress with Clinton's anti-crime legislation. In the women's movement, we've got stratification where if there had been a mass-based multi-class orientation among some women's organizations, we probably would have been aware earlier of the threat against reproductive rights and more in a better position. But now it's kind of catching up because people are going, oh my God, we lost Roe. How did this happen? Well, it was predictable. And I'm going back to what Paul said and the conversation about cadre organizations and strategic preparation or planning for various things. The way I understand the current way that cadre is being used by the Left Roots offshoot that Steve Williams is involved with is that it means we need organizations where people are committed to action and participation, not just paper memberships. One of the weaknesses of DSA is that we have, coming from being so small before the Bernie upsurge, we didn't distinguish between leadership and just dues-paying members. And I think we need to get more sophisticated in seeing the roles of different organizational types in this common project.
Stephen, if I can, I think that a lot of not just women's groups, but progressive groups ignored the uprising of women in Iran because it was Iran and because of a flawed form of anti-imperialism. believing that because the U.S. is in opposition to Iran, that it would be wrong for us to support movements that challenge the Iranian theocracy. And I think that this has come up time and again. It's not just in Iran. We saw versions of this with Zimbabwe. We see it with Nicaragua, etc. This idea of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And there was a particular variant of that, I believe, when it came to this uprising in Iran that was despicable, to be blunt.
Well put. Good point, Susan. So before we still have a ways. I want to acknowledge also here today, not to put you on the spot, David Worley and Fred Murphy, who, along with me and Lisa now, are presently trying to hold the MEP together. And Fred and David put together a number of the programs and weekly groups. And just want to acknowledge that you're here. And of course, you can say something if you want to. And I also want to acknowledge that of the weekly groups we have, Peruse convenes a study group that's been going on now for a couple of years, reading Gramsci's prison notebooks, very relevant to this. And Carl and I think one or two other people here participate in that. And then also Rebecca and I convened a new group, which is reading these books about organization and political strategy. So a lot of things happening here every week. And if you have an idea for something you would like to see us do, you should let us know. Okay, Kim just put a question in the chat, which I'll come to in a minute. So I wanted to say two things. First of all, this has been great conversation so far. I have to say this is the longest I think I've ever seen Bill go without referencing a movie. So I feel like I have to do it. And it's not a political struggle topic, but it did, as I was thinking about it earlier, getting ready for this. So another weekly group here, Read Science Fiction stuff, and I got this book got this Arrival out of the library. Probably many people have seen the movie Arrival with Visitors Land. Won't use the A word. And there's three main characters. Amy Adams is the scientist, Jeremy Renner is the scientist, and Forrest Whitaker is like the government representative. And what's interesting, what struck me just thinking about it, and it just like a light bulb went on relative to this thing, is that in the book, which was written 20 years ago, the name of the story is Story of Your Life. It's a long, short story. And it focuses on the fact that these three, especially the Amy Adams character, have spent their whole life, their whole professional life, anticipating the arrival of people from other worlds. They were ready when the event happened, just the way we were talking about it. But in the movie and in the republication of the book, it's changed into Arrival. In other words, focusing on the unpredictable event at that time, and not being part of the screenwriting. It just seems like it changes the meaning of it. And maybe I wouldn't have thought about that a week ago, but it seems very parallel to what we're talking about today. because it was the story of their life to imagine that, to know that this was going to happen without knowing when. So very similar to what we're talking about now. And the other comment I was going to make is that at the beginning, Carl referenced this, one of the books, the other books that we're reading by Rodrigo Nunez, either vertical nor horizontal. And there's one place where he mentions he mentions a quote from Gramsci, which I found, and I just want to read it because it relates to what we're talking about. This is in a section on spontaneity, not horizontalism, but spontaneity. He says, the word spontaneity can be variously defined because it refers to multifaceted phenomena. One needs to point out, however, that pure spontaneity does not exist in history. It would be the same thing as pure mechanicity. Of course, with AI, maybe we're getting to that. The elements of conscious leadership in the most spontaneous of movements cannot be ascertained simply because they have left no verifiable document. One may say that the element of spontaneity is therefore characteristic of the, quote, history of subaltern classes, and especially of the most marginal and peripheral elements of those classes who have not attained a consciousness of the class per se, and who consequently do not even suspect that their history might possibly have importance or that it might be of any value to leave documentary evidence of this. In these movements, then, there exists a multiplicity of elements of conscious leadership, but none of them predominates or goes beyond the level of popular science, common sense, that is in the traditional conception of the world. I mean, I realize it's hard to read a section from Gramsci out of context, but he's saying even in the most spontaneous, what appears to be the most spontaneous of movements, because the people in it have not left a written record, there is leadership, there is precursor. And that quote, which Nunez also makes a lot of, seems important for us to keep in mind. There's never a pure spontaneity. I don't know whether. Okay.
Can I be on the stack?
Say again? Yeah. Kim posted a question. No. Do you want me to read it? I will read it. And then you can add to it, unless you want to speak.
I can read it.
Go for it.
What are some examples of leaders in the article? What if a leader, let me back up. Who are we talking about and what are we talking about? What if a leader is an elected official that is controversial within left circles because the person is not pure enough? For example, Jamal Bowman or AOC would receive criticism or something like that. And not to say that leaders are necessarily elected officials, but it wasn't very clear in terms of who are we talking about? What type of person are we talking about?
Responding, Carl?
Leaders, number one, have followers.
Right.
That's probably the most important thing. The SA can attack AOC all they want for not being a proper leader, but the fact of the matter is she has followers, not only in her district, but she has followers all over the country, and in very large numbers, in the millions. So AOC is a leader. She's a very good one, in my opinion. She knows when to push the envelope, and she knows when to draw back a bit. And so far, I'm quite happy with her, referring to her as one of my leaders. That's one example. The other examples, are, closer to home, perhaps. They're the people who not only, like AOC did, go out, build a community organization, and win an election, but they have done the work of building an organization, building a union of the steelworkers, carrying on a strike through a great deal of difficulties. Workers listen to them, workers follow them, workers argue with them, but eventually workers elect them to positions in their unions and in their local political organizations. So those are my ideas of who leaders are. There are others, though, who don't do any of those things, but serve as leaders nonetheless. The one I was most influenced by was Carl Oglesby, who was an intellectual, and not any traditional intellectual. He was an organic intellectual, and a very powerful one and a very eloquent one, who caused me to think in different directions that have served me well over the years. So he was an intellectual leader.
Yeah, I'd like to think of it formal leaders and leaders with a small L. And we on the left need to always be looking for those leaders with a small L. Those are the people that we've got to win over. Those are the people that have networks and followers, etc. And sometimes they overlap. And so the Jabal Bowman controversy in DSA was embarrassing and really dangerous because of the assumption that some DSA members had that an elected official could be controlled the way you would control a robot on Mars through sending the right communication. And see, I got it in there, Steve. And
I was first.
I think when we look at that, it's very dangerous. That we have to understand that as Carl was pointing out, that there are people that are going to be elected or leading organizations that they have a broader constituency, which raises some really important questions for us. And I know the CP and others had to deal with this when some of their members became leaders of mass organizations or elected leaders. And how do you direct that person's work? What happens? Because now they're not simply members of your organization. They have this broader constituency to which they are accountable. And how do you work that out? And often it doesn't get worked out. And so people leave organizations. So that's the way I look at this: leaders, the formal leaders, as well as leaders with a small L.
Good stuff. I see Janet, and then Peruse.
Okay, I wanted to speak to a couple things. One thing is question of leaders. There's all kinds of leaders, and we don't have to agree with all the leaders that we work with sometimes to actually do the work. And one example I wanted to raise in terms of like movements and spontaneous movements and how we react to them is I lived in Lexington, Kentucky for 30 years. And I worked with a number of groups, a peace group and a community action group, etc. And one thing I heard people raise all the time is, why do we have no young people involved? How do we get young people involved? But then Occupy Lexington happened, and there were lots of young people on the street. And one thing I noticed is all the people used to complain about no young people there. you never saw them down at Occupy. You know, they didn't recognize the significance of it. And I mean, I was involved from the first day until the last. Well, last day we were all at a demonstration at the state capitol, and the police came and tore everything down. But you know, I was involved the whole time. There were people that I agreed with, and there were people that I disagreed with. But the people that I met made everything worthwhile. The conversations that went on, I learned so much from. And you know, you're not going to instantaneously change people's minds, but you have to work within those parameters. And just one example. One person was there who I strongly disagreed with some of her things that she wanted to do, and some of the things she would raise in these hour-long general assemblies and stuff. And I really disagreed with a lot of her stuff. But now she's a leading activist there, and you know, people change and grow, and you know, we talk these things out. So we can't just base our what we're involved with on who the leaders are. You know, we have to work within these organizations, and you know, and we have to take advantage of them when they come up, and not just ask where all the young people. They're not coming to our group. Sometimes we need to go with them and work with them, and you know, and things come out of that. When the Occupy died, I mean, some people disappeared, other people I'm still in contact with. So I think, you know, I think all that's really worth paying attention to. Thank you. And I appreciate Carl and Bill's presentation. It was wonderful. And appreciate the MEP. Thank you.
That's a great story to fill in the details of what Bill and Carl said. So thank you. Peruse.
Yes, just very briefly, I think it's Machiavelli that comes and says that it's in peacetime that you plan for war. Just to expand on Janet's comment and a short comment that Bill made, I feel like in a chess game, when you're playing, your opponent has made some moves or has certain options in terms of their move. But if you are playing, your opponent is not just you. I mean, just the other side. Your major opponent is yourself in terms of how you block your future opening moves, right? If you apply this strategy and tactic to the notion of the American left and the progressive forces, there are two parts that I feel like they are missing and blocking themselves. The first is that on international issues, they are unaware of what is happening left of center in any part of the world, be it in Mexico, be it in Iraq, be it in Iran, and what have you. And they're always caught by surprise, right? Because I don't want to go into the detail of it, but one is that's one major criticism I have. And the second is that they are unaware of the ability that is in front of them in terms of the languages that they can use in advancing their causes. And this pertains to Black Lives Matter, to race issues, to gender issues. And these are international issues that is affecting all of us across all national boundaries.
Well put. Who else? I did have some more questions, but I feel like everybody's already heard enough from me.
Oh, I just wanted to add one last point to Bill's comment on Nicaragua. I think it's very interesting that the Nicaraguans, and I was active for the Sandinistas when they were coming into power 20, 30 years ago. But today, the Nicaraguan government comes in support of the Islamic State of Iran when it comes to the violation of human rights. The American left has something to say on this.
Absolutely.
I'll just mention, Peruse's comment reminded me that another podcast, actually, series of podcasts since October 7th, the Dig radio, which is loosely associated with Jacobin magazine, has had many hours of programming on the Middies on right now it's like 4-part, 8 or 9 hours on the rise of Arab nationalism in the 20th century. But there have been a number of ones about Palestine and the current struggle and the history of struggle. And I recommend it. Yeah, Fred just put it in the chat. And also earlier in the chat, Fred put in some information about some of the current and soon planned reading groups that are coming up, including on environmental crisis. So take a look at that. And Susan, you are up once again.
Thank you. I want to encourage us to continue the discussion about leadership because when I came into a job in the labor movement, I had a very liberal approach to, oh, we need equals, not leaders. And I think there's a lot of anti-leadership sentiment out there. People that occur to me, well, I think part of what we could discuss are the different roles, like Carl was mentioning Carl Oglesby as an intellectual. I mean, we've got Max Elbaum and the Convergence collective there doing intellectual work and leadership for strategy formation. There's Sean Fenn with the auto workers, and Bernie Sanders retains quite a bit of leadership influence. Part of our strategic planning needs to be how to ally with leaders and figure out appropriate roles for them. But of course, grabbing media is not the same as building organizations and having followers. The Facebook category of followers is relevant, but what you really see with a true leader is that they can activate and assign appropriate tasks to people and encourage their growth in the organization. So I think it's an underdeveloped area of our thinking.
I would say, Susan, that there are different kinds of leaders. There are some good ones, bad ones. There are fascists. There are leftists. And one of the styles of leadership that we on the left have difficulty grappling with is populist leaders. And I'm thinking about people like Jesse Jackson, but also Hugo Chavez, for whom I had respect for both of them, but I had a certain kind of respect for Chavez. But with populist leaders, what we underestimate is that they don't want to be constrained by organization. And they revolt against organization in different ways. Sometimes it's by making very rapid and unusual changes within an organization that seem to, for no apparent reason. In other cases, disempowering people who should be making decisions. Sometimes it can be full paranoia. But this is a real problem. So you take, I'm not going to mention other names, but there are some leaders out there that are really good people, but they're strongly resistant to organization. And you can't force them. That's what we got to understand. And we can ally with them. That's really what it comes down to. Because they won't accept the discipline of an organization. And I think we've got to grapple with that. And then there's within our own ranks how to build the kind of positive leadership that you're describing. And part of that, I believe, is term limits. Now, we need to be fighting for term limits in organizations. You know, I'm thinking about not just elected leaders, but I mean elected positions in government, but I mean in like unions and mass organizations. I mean, there's too many organizations where the leaders get carried out as opposed to where they leave on their own, retire, or whatever. And it becomes very hard on the culture of the organization when there are not term limits, because then people that choose to challenge the leaders are often viewed as disloyal. And so the organization freezes in time. I think we got to grapple with that as well.
Good, good points. I'm going to call on David in a minute. We're getting towards the end, and I want Bill and Carl to be each thinking about three things to leave us with. I mean, we started with a very specific topic of movement building and campaign building, and we've ranged pretty far. And was thinking I would try to pull together the threads, but I'd rather you guys did that. So maybe give the thought 3 points to leave us with. And then before that, David.
Oh, does Rebecca want to say something? She had a point in the chat.
Oh, yeah. Rebecca. Sorry.
Hi, I'm sorry. Now, just a question. I'm not expert on Venezuela, but I understand that the people in Venezuela, I mean, across the country, are greatly organized, and this organization was heavily encouraged by Chavez, and they continue to be organized. And I'm not sure I agree that he was against, any sort of input or control from people organized below.
Yeah, I put in the chat. Chavez absolutely encouraged organization, no question about it, and did very little to build the party that he had announced, and very little to build the Fifth International. And I don't hold him solely responsible for that. But it was clear from discussions I've had with folks there and around there that this was not something that was prioritized the way that it really needed to be. Both of those projects. And those were very major projects. Like when the Fifth International idea was announced, I mean, people all around the world, leftists, were just like enthralled with the idea, and many people were looking for ways to help to build it. Didn't happen. And I think if you look at some of what Venezuela is going through now, it's in part the result of real difficulties on succession and on the question of the party. That's what I was getting at.
Okay, as I said, I'm not expert on Venezuela, and probably you know more about it, but just wanted to.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool.
Thank you. David.
Well, I want to go back to something I think it was Bill said quite a while ago, that we need a party of 1 million people. And I was sitting here thinking, there certainly are 1 million people that probably could be part of a broad-based party in the United States. That's still a small minority of the population. But I mean, I think the people are there, but then I'm looking, we got 25 odd people, between 25 and 30 people we've had in this conversation. Maybe we could all be part of a single organization, but we're not. So why aren't we? And I don't have the answer to that, but I think the number of people is there. But the question is, and it does come down to this question of what kind of an organization could be put together that would bring all these people together in an organization, and what is holding that back, other than our own egos in some cases, probably. But so that is a question for anybody that wants to tackle it, because I don't have an answer.
Maybe Paul does.
No,
Well,
it's not an answer, but just an elaboration. I had said, well said, David. I mean, we do need to have a party of a million, but it won't be a monolithic party. I think we have to realize that. And people like ourselves who are leaders or intellectuals, we have to realize that we can't make up the majority of the membership of that party. I mean, we have to be encouraging people to join that we don't agree with on everything. And that is, I will say with some pride that DSA is trying to become a big tent organization. There are a lot of centrifugal tendencies there, and there are a lot of people who would rather have it small and controllable. But I think that the best elements in DSA have a certain loyalty toward building out a much larger organization. And our current struggles about whether we can have enough staff and resources, because we have to raise our dues in order to do that, are real and genuine. And I just feel that I'm very happy to be part of a process where I'm trying to think through the things that I've been involved with for many years. I mean, I've been a leader of a union or a member of a executive committee of DSA or other progressive organizations for much of my life. And I've never I have no idea how you solve those issues, but I think the kinds of thinking that I've heard here are really helpful. I think we can really build something great, make America great again. We can build a great American left. We just have to have the patience and the forbearance to keep working on it together. But it won't be a monolithic party, and I don't think we'll all be merging into a single organization. It might be more like a swarm of bees, but it's going to be something where we actually can fly together. And that's the trick we need to learn very quickly. Thanks.
Well, if you look into the science of it, you'll find that those swarms of bees and swarms of birds that you see are actually, even though they're separate entities, they are also social creatures, and they are very well organized.
Well, we're social creatures too, Carl. We just need to stop thinking of ourselves as isolated individuals.
Sometimes we need to push a little. Like, I'm known for not being bashful about asking people to join my organizations, or at least to consider it. Right now, my favorite one to have people to take a look at is Liberation Road. There's others too. In my town here, I try to get people to get behind Bernie and the organizations related to him, the Squad, and so on. When I'm out talking among the masses, I always wear my Bernie hat to engage people in conversation and to pull them into organizations that we have on the ground that are related to that. I will say one thing that from my own life, though, that people might find kind of funny. I started in the anti-war movement at Penn State, and one time we brought in an outside speaker to show Viet Cong films, and it caused a big scandal. And as a result, we had like 500 people in the room, and I had to introduce them. I'd never gotten before that big audience, and I froze. I couldn't say a word. And so I was so frustrated afterwards. Our little group, we said, okay, we got to solve this problem. So we got a big wooden box and painted soap on it and put it right in the center of campus. And every day when classes were changing, we forced ourselves to get up and give speeches. Even if we just read an article from the New York Times, and we did it over and over. Then when I moved to Nebraska, to go to be a philosophy instructor. We did the same thing. Two of us from Penn State who were SDS members by then. First thing we did, we said, well, how are we going to build an organization here? Well, we set up, we called a Hyde Park Forum in the Student Union building. We got the agree to set out a microphone every Thursday afternoon. And then we got up and forced ourselves to give speeches on one thing or another. I could hardly give a decent speech, you know. Later on, you know, when I was elected to the SDS national office, I had no idea. The day before, I had no idea they were going to do it. I had written a paper which everybody loved, Student Syndicalism. I think they liked the word in the title more than the actual article. But so there I was. So what did I have to do? I had to learn. You had to work at it. So I traveled to 150 campuses, and every one of them I would give speeches. I would gather people together. I would try to consolidate them. So step by step, I went from a guy who was completely tongue-tied and didn't know how to give a public speech if his life depended upon it, to something that was rather different. But you have to train people at it, and you have to work at it yourself, and you have to invite people to join.
Cool. Let Bill have the last word, but before that, Carl, 3 points, just the points, not more, just 3 headlines.
Okay. Don't build a movement, build campaigns. That's number 1. Leaders have followers. Find the ones who do. That's number 2. One organization isn't enough. You'll need many. That's number 3.
Well done. Bill, comment and 3 takeaways.
3 takeaways. Study history vigorously. Seek truth from facts. And properly distinguish friends from enemies. And in terms of final thoughts, I think if you look at organizations like DSA or the CP at its best, there were always going to be multiple tendencies within those organizations. The question is whether there is enough coherence to say you're all part of the same organization. That's part of my criticism of DSA. That depending on which caucus you're speaking to and what part of the country you're in, you could be talking to like a different DSA. And I think that there needs to be, and I'm not saying that to trash DSA, I think that there needs to be coherence. People need to be able to feel that they're part of a thing, even when there are differences, and that the differences can be handled in a way that don't lead to shootouts at central committee meetings. And that's really challenging. And yes, Dave, I think that there could be an umbrella formation at some point. But for that to work, there needs to be, whether it's an umbrella formation or just a large organization, there needs to be an agreed upon focus. What's the main work, right? And the other part of it is that if the organization doesn't get race and the national question, it will fail. And an organization can't be all over the place around race and the national question. It can't be all over the place about sex and gender. It's got to have a very coherent theory of these and their relationship to the overall class struggle. And so what we end up having sometimes are these duels between so-called identity politics and reductionism. I shouldn't say identity politics, let's call it essentialism. And as opposed to understanding the whole notion of overdetermination, which I think, people should read a little Althu's there. So it's not going to be easy because this issue of mountain stronghold mentality is very strong within the left, and it is encouraged in the foundation world by foundations. And it's not just the foundations, we're living in many ways the legacy of Reaganism. Reaganism had an impact on the left that we don't really talk about, but the promotion of individualism, the promotion of entrepreneurialism, the promotion of brand, right? Everybody has to have their own brand. And this has affected and infected the left. So you have people that identify as leftists who are more concerned about developing their brand than they are about developing even their own organization. So we need a little bit of a cultural revolution within our ranks.
Well, good note to end on.